All right. Let's welcome Mark O'Connor to Talk Back. Hey, Mark, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Hopefully that mic is working. Will you test it for us?
All right.
There we go. All right.
Thank you.
Mark, today was spectacular. Thanks to you and Maggie for another incredible musical performance for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's always a privilege to play at your services here, and I think, I mean, you know, we draw so much inspiration from the Word and your messages as well. So it's great.
Thank you. Good duo, tag team. Yeah. So today we get an amazing chance to sit down with Mark, who just wrote a new book about his career, about being a child prodigy, and first I want to say congratulations to you about the book. It's a triumph in and of itself, and it's very well written. And Fran actually gave me her copy, and I read through it all in one day, which Carrie is very annoyed at me about. But I learned to read from my mother, and that's where I wanted to start with you. Is I was really taken by how much of an influence your mom was on your life in music. She was really into classical music and into gospel and really all kinds of music. And it feels like her love of music was contagious and rubbed off on you.
Yeah. This book really, it's not only dedicated to her, but it is also about her, her relationship with her son, and this young boy that was discovering music and vicariously living through her own wishes and ambitions and hardships, falling on hard times. She was the eternal artist and eclectic that always envisioned a life of arts for her, and it didn't work out that way. And so I popped out, and I shown a proclivity for music, and she really embraced that and helped me.
A lot of families that would have a prodigy as a child would struggle to figure out how to kind of get out of the way or guide their children into the right direction. And there were some times in your story when it looked like you might end up under the house with the snakes, as you say, working with your father, and or just going to school like everybody else and dealing with the pressures of being a middle schooler, middle school is horrible for everybody, but it was particularly bad for you. What do you think it was? You said it was probably, you feel like it was her love and her passion for herself, but there were also twists and turns where she made split-second decisions that changed your life and allowed you to blossom and flourish into the prodigy that you are. It was just amazing to see that. How do you think that she was able to do that for you?
Well, this book is really about a journey with no roadmap. There is a history of prodigy in music, and those folks usually go right into classical music. For one reason is because that's where all the really good teachers and pedagogy is, and it's been there for hundreds of years. And it's interesting that my mother, being such a huge classical music aficionado, allowed me to start making my own choices towards my musical dreams, even at age 11. And she wanted to follow me and really have me set my course. And then it was up to her to try to figure out how to get me there as well as she could. And she also, during the entire book, was really slowly dying of cancer. And at some point, when I was very young, 13, 14, she couldn't drive me any place anymore. And so this book is really about a journey, trying to discover a unique path in life, and trusting young children to dream, to imagine, and have that be the inspiration of an entire family that held everybody together when perhaps it would have all fallen apart and worse.
Yeah. Her story is as beautiful as yours, and I love how it's a weaving of your stories together, and the dedication to her sort of makes it special. I was thinking about, you mentioned all the teachers in the classical world. That's not where you went, and I cannot help but see divine providence or the Holy Spirit in how you met Benny Thomason. I mean, what was he doing in Oregon, right? Like, you're in Oregon, he should be in Texas, right? The world's most renowned Texas fiddler, right, at the time. And somehow he's in Oregon, and you happen to run into him, and he happens to take an interest in you from hearing you play at 11, and decides he wants to be your teacher for free. I mean, how does that even happen? To me, it's like, that's where it all kind of begins. That's like the moment that everything starts to click together, because without that, I don't think you become you, right? Without Benny.
The very first chapter I've titled The Great Teacher, and he was. He saw me play as a beginner, basically, but he saw something in me, in that little boy, that he wanted to nurture, and it was very unusual. He ended up teaching me all day long, and day and a half long lessons every other weekend. It was a 3-hour drive. He convinced my mother that it was worth it, and he was, as Ben was saying, one of the greatest old-time fiddlers in American history. He had just happened to retire. He actually lived on the Washington border to Oregon, and he thought his own days of playing music, for a large extent, was kind of over, and he was looking for a more peaceful, quiet place with his wife, and then I came along, and at first, my book is also about being inspired by these American music legends and me being around them, and the unique relationship that I developed with them, because as the book unveils, I was the first child musician in bluegrass, old-time fiddling, country music, even swing and jazz on this instrument. It's hard to believe that in my lifetime, because you think of fiddling, you think of tons of kids, but as little ago as the 1970s, I was really the first one that could actually play and go toe-to-toe with these old-timers, these legends, and play in the competitions against them and win half the time. So I drew a unique amount of attention from these legends, and so it's a story about that. Benny Thomason being, really central to the story. But it was his, prescience that allowed us to believe that music meant the difference. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book in my childhood story in music, especially, because I wanted to have it be an inspirational story for others, for parents, for kids, to show what music and the arts can bring to a family and turn it around.
One of the things that Benny gave you, in addition to all those lessons, is the famous white fiddle, right? If people haven't seen it, they might not understand what it was like to show up at a fiddling competition with a white instrument that had been found in a barn, and many called it like an eyesore and didn't like it at all, but it was very unique, and it also was very loud, right? And so you were able to, in some ways, outplay, not just because of technical skill, but louder in these places where they didn't have great amplification. Yeah. So talk about how the white fiddle came to be and what it's meant to you in your life.
One of the main characters of the book is this infamous white painted fiddle. And Benny Thomason, my then teacher, found it in a barn. He traded a fishing rod for it. And he was going to use it for parts because he was a part-time violin fiddle repairer in his trailer house. And he thought he could surely use the neck off of it for another fiddle he was working on. But before he dismantled it completely, he found some pegs that fit, cut a bridge for it, cut a sound post for it, strung it up, just in case it sounded good. And he unveiled a canon of an instrument. And the next day, or the next week, when my mother drove me down for my lesson, I just so happened that I grew like almost a foot in that year, and I really needed to upgrade to a new fiddle. And I saw the eyesore hanging on his wall, and I said, "What is that?" And he said, "Mark, I've been saving that for you." And I couldn't put it down. It was unbelievable instrument. I still have it today, and for several times in my career, I've retired it completely. For 15 years, it hung in the Country Music Hall of Fame in Nashville. And then I got it back out because I missed it. And so I'm actually taking it on the road again and playing at least a tune on it, because it is magic, and it doesn't need to be played that much. It can just sit there and then just speak. So it's part of the interesting story of my childhood.
What made you decide to start having people sign it?
Well, for one, it was so ugly. And the white fiddle was an eyesore, and people laughed at it. People also laughed at me when I was a little kid. First of all, just because I was little and playing the fiddle, that was an oddity. Also, I looked like a girl for a couple of years. People mistaken me for a girl. That was weird for me. And I was dealing with that, and then I had the white fiddle, and I just couldn't get away from being the odd duck, and that kind of lended itself for me to find my own creativity. And that was really another theme of this book. Wasn't just about being a technically proficient musician as a child, but trying to find a way that I could express myself so people could understand me as a child. And through music, it was wonderful. I couldn't speak like this when I was 12 and 13. I didn't have the words, and I didn't have the reach, and I was embarrassed most of the time. But when you put that violin under my chin, then everything became natural, And so I wanted to write about that process, about children being heard through their instruments. And that's one of the reasons why we are starting our string camp here right today. We're checking people in at 4 o'clock. We're holding registration open just in case there might be a prospective student out there. We actually have lots of kids coming, but lots of adults who also are learning. We've got accomplished adults, but we've got a lot of beginning adult musicians. We have students up to 70. Our age ranges are 7 to 70. But the idea that an instrument in American culture was so significant, and it helped all of us. And I think, I want to play a part in trying to encourage, wooden instruments, brass instruments, whatever the case might be, but a real instrument rather than always, GarageBand on the iPad or laptop, which can be artistic too. I don't want to be up here slamming different types of artistic approaches, but man, it's so great to be able to give a young child an instrument to learn. I think that's really a fundamental American cultural process that we've been in, and we've been a long time a musical country, and I think that could help.
Yeah, absolutely. Take us back to the summer of 1974. This, for me, in the book reading, I felt like I was transported into that vehicle that your family was driving around from competition to competition to competition. And then, I told you this before worship, the 2 weeks in Nashville, for me, I felt like I was in Nashville with you, the way you vividly described that, where you weren't even going to go. I mean, you'd won these competitions and you weren't even going to go to Nashville, but your mom really wanted you to go, and it turned out to be a moment that changed your life forever. You recorded your first album there, you were on the Grand Ole Opry, all in a 2-week period when you were 12. So take us back to what it was like to live that summer.
Well, once again, the interesting setting of growing up in Seattle, Washington, and somehow a kid wanting to play the fiddle and showed promise for it. And then, other than Benny Thomason and maybe a handful of other players in the entire Northwest that were at all on a professional level, most of this music was down here in the Southeast, Texas, Southwest as well, but a lot of it was over here. And so my mom said, we got to get young Mark over there to the Southeast this summer. And I was 12. And so I actually have an excerpt from the book. The memoir looks like this. It's called Crossing Bridges. And there's a companion photo book as well called A Musical Childhood in Pictures. And so my mother, we were very poor. We didn't even have air conditioning in that van in the summer. Had no idea what we were going to hit. But she had, her one prized item was that Nikon camera that she always had around her neck. That was her artistry during my musical years as a child. And she captured all these images of me interacting with these legends that were meeting me and playing with me. So, but I have, and also I have an archival CD that traces these same years as well, called Early Childhood Recordings. But if you wouldn't mind, I'll read an excerpt from the memoir about that, just that moment, those moments we're talking about. So my mother drove me into this 2nd Avenue club called the Pick and Parlor. There I met a few musicians, got on stage with them, and they had me on stage for the rest of the night. Several of them said, we got to take you out to the Grand Ole Opry to meet Roy Acuff, the king of country music. And I didn't quite know what all this was about, but I thought, boy, I'm having such a good time playing the fiddle. This just sounds like another chance to play more fiddle. So I was going to just simply play for him in his dressing room. So the story picks up here. 1974 at the Grand Ole Opry. From the memoir. Roy Acuff's dressing room door remained open as I played. The room marked number 1 was the final door before the Opry artists entered the wings of the prestigious stage itself. As I played the fiddle, Opry artists, one after another, stuck their heads in through the door to see what all the fuss and bother was about. Some of the stars listened for a minute in the doorway and moved on to the stage for their slot on the show. Still others, who had more time, came all the way into the now crammed room for a closer listen. As Roy Acuff yelled out, "Play another one!" some of the stars, with their guitars already strapped around their neck, joined in with Charlie Collins to play some additional accompaniment. Country artists who were compelled to join in with us included honky-tonk singer Charlie Walker, who sang his hit, "Pick Me Up on Your Way Down," that night on stage. Another honky-tonk singer, Ernest Tubb, who sang one of his hit songs on stage, "Walking the Floor Over You," also played a little rhythm guitar while supporting us with his big toothy smile. As Roy Acuff said, "Do another," more Opry artists filed in to join us. Billy Grammer, whose big hit was "Gotta Travel On," couldn't resist the temptation to play some with the little kid. Even little Jimmy Dickens, "Take an Old Cold Hater and Wait," Not being able to contain his enthusiasm, got on his tiptoes, pulling himself to about as short as I was. He was excited to strum along for a few chords before he abruptly stopped playing, choosing to listen instead. Other Opry members came in to hear me for a few minutes. Hank Snow, Jumpin' Bill Carlisle, Dottie West, Jan Howard, the Browns, and Whisperin' Bill Anderson, one after another. The Opry fiddlers started filing into Roy Acuff's dressing room to watch me play. Many of Nashville's top fiddlers were there, and they stayed in the room the longest. A fiddler sporting thick gray curly hair, Curly Fox, predated even Acuff at the Opry. One of the things Fox was known for back in the 1930s was performing in traveling road shows around the South, hosting world championship fiddle contests. Fiddler Stoney Cooper was there listening. He performed with his wife, Wilma Lee Cooper, as an Opry act. Marty Robbins' manager, fiddler Louis Dunn, was standing there the entire time I played. Fiddler Skeeter Willis with the Opry act, the Willis brothers, was taking notice too. His three-brother act became members in 1946. Some of the older Opry stars shouted out requests for fiddle tunes they knew best. Tunes common with country square dance music. How about a little Soldier's Joy, Arkansas Traveler, Devil's Dream, Cotton-Eyed Joe? They knew some fiddle tunes, all right. Interestingly, I hadn't the faintest idea who a lot of these people were. Out in Seattle, we couldn't get the Grand Ole Opry on the radio at all. A little excerpt from the book there.
Thank you for reading that. To me, there's a spirituality of that moment. There's something deeply sacred about it. It's almost like the great cloud of witnesses in real life surrounding you as a child and supporting you in this gift that you'd been given and finding their own way to try to not only enjoy it, but to lift you up and to support you, which is what Roy did and so many other of the greats. But there's also this other story in the book of the resistance, a story of there is the humiliation, people trying to humiliate a child, people being very threatened by a child prodigy, people who didn't like your innovation, that thought you should have to play the tunes the way they were written before you could improvise on them, which was not your style at all, and Benny taught you that, right? And it seems like there's been this theme throughout your career as you've dealt with the music community and gotten to know them and the recording industry and all the things about music where there's like the fights between Texas fiddling and bluegrass as if they shouldn't be on the same album, and things that would seem really strange to an outsider and were strange to you, I think, when you first encountered them. So you've got this sort of rebellious side to you and an innovative side to you that sometimes, and also being a prodigy, sometimes made things hard. There were those who supported you, right? And some of the greats ever supported you. And then there were some that were not very supportive at all. What did you draw on to be able to deal with that resistance and sometimes even outright hatred and rejection that you've experienced throughout your career?
Yeah, there's one story in the book where we show up at Galax, Virginia, when I was 12 years old, and my reputation evidently preceded me because they wouldn't let me enter the competition there, and they literally escorted my mom and my younger sister, who was 9, and me off the grounds by security because they didn't want anybody to find out that this little kid from Seattle was kicked out of the competition that could have won the contest, and in their words, cause a riot because of my age and maybe where I was from. And in the 1960s and 70s, old-time music circles were dominated by older folks. People with long gray beards won those fiddle competitions. And the hippies were trying, they wanted a piece of this action, but they were pretty amateur. They weren't authentic yet. And then this little kid fiddler being taught to be authentic to the music in my own creative way, in my own voice. People couldn't even match me up with Benny Thompson. I didn't sound like him. Imagine that, a little kid, impressionable. I mean, I could copy people too. That's what was the wild thing about it. I could not only copy Benny and sound like him, but I could sound like about 10 others, because all young people go through an impressionable stage. But I was also bound, determined, hidebound, to search for my own personal expression, and I had that. Imagery, and I dreamed about it, and it transported me to these musical places that I wanted to be.
And you broke down a lot of musical cliques, as you talk about in the book, and walls throughout your career by the way that you had an innovative path, and you were your own person, and you were kind of one with the music, and the cultural phenomenon of the music world couldn't really put you in a box or a mold, and so sometimes it just couldn't understand you, right? And that must have been sometimes frustrating, I'm sure.
Yeah, early on, I realized that the music, my instruments were my safe harbor. And then when I started to get rejection from it, it kind of just rocked my world and turned everything upside down. And I had to find a belief in myself. And so I want to inspire people to not give up on themselves, and to find that core that makes them unique, and stand for it. I didn't get a lot of places in life listening to all the people that said no to me. I learned how to navigate around them, and story after story, I'm hit, pushed up against a wall, and I figure out how to go around it or climb it, for a new opportunity. And so I think it's there's a message in there for kind of all walks of life. And I simply did it with my fiddle.
It's inspiring, really, how you faced so much resistance in different times and different ages that you were, and found a way around it or through it, staying true to yourself and to the music. That's what really inspired me in the story. Like your mother, my father is who turned me on to music and turned me on to your music. And when I was a child, this is just I'm going to take a personal moment here. When I was a child, my parents drove me to the North Carolina mountains from Pennsylvania, where I grew up, every summer. And every summer we listened to the same album. I've told you this before. The Telluride Sessions by Strength in Numbers, which is you and Bela Fleck and Sam Bush and oh man, it's an amazing album. And my parents didn't call it the Telluride Sessions; they called it Plunky Plunk. And we listened to it because my dad is crazy about Jerry Douglas, but we fell in love with you and your violin playing on that album. And so I asked my father, I told him I was going to interview you today, and I said, what do you want to ask Mark O'Connor? And so my father said, ask him what's the hardest thing he's ever had to learn how to play.
Well, I think one of the most difficult things for me was to compose my first fiddle concerto, which that was an effort in itself, but I didn't compose it for me to play, because I didn't think, number one, I could play it, and that I knew how to play it with an orchestra or to be able to follow a conductor. Because at this point in my professional career, at age about 30 years old, I already had some success now behind me, but it didn't prevent me from taking real risks and taking big chances. And I learned that from my childhood. I mean, I would say that my transition into classical music, bringing along with me my fiddling, was one of the great challenges of my musical life. And all those people that were laughing at me at 12 and 13, and when they first saw me with the white fiddle and saw there was a kid playing fiddle music, well, people were laughing at me when I was 30 in the orchestra. Like, what's this guy doing here? Now, of course, even 30 years later, you look at orchestral programming out there and you wouldn't believe it. Like, I mean, I feel like I'm a part of this breakthrough, you know? Half the people in Strength in Numbers play with symphony orchestra now. You know, like for instance, I mean, that would be unheard of 30 years ago. So it's just a constant, preparing yourself to be open to new things. That's my journey, and I've never quit. And I mean, just the fact that we're holding a string camp here based on my method, the O'Connor method. How dare I do that? How dare I come up with a method that could, challenge existing pedagogy by insisting that American music and American music culture should be shared with young children on the violin, especially African American music. The spirituals, the African American spirituals, the blues, the ragtime, the hoedowns, the jazz. I mean, to me, this is like fundamental to music education, and to have the violin left out of that seems like not a great thing. So I took my, whatever name I was able to build for myself by this point, and I authored at age 45. I authored the O'Connor method of instruction from beginning all the way through advanced materials, and now tens of thousands of children have learned to play the violin using the O'Connor method. We actually just did a teacher training session up in Highlands a couple of weeks ago, and there was a 19-year-old woman in the teacher training session. She's a member of the Danville, Virginia Symphony. And when we were introducing each other in the class, in the seminar, she said that she learned how to play violin using my books at age 4. So it's the book series has only been out for 14 years. Pretty much the length of this woman's journey in music, from age 4, learning from my method, to being in the Danville, Virginia Symphony, not just a bluegrass fiddler in a band in a club somewhere, but in the symphony. So and she proved what my premise was at the outset, was that if you give a holistic environment of education, music education, to a child, and open them up to the possibilities, then they can start navigating and choosing their own path. And that path could be to country and bluegrass, it could be to jazz, it could be to playing in a symphony orchestra, So it's played out. My dream, my vision for that, it played out in real time in this 14 years, and we see it here, manifested in that young woman from Danville, Virginia.
Well, your memoir is entitled Crossing Bridges, and that's what you've been doing between musical genres, but also, and now you're teaching others to cross bridges like you did. But it's like, what you've done is also a metaphor for what needs to be done in American culture at large. And you've already kind of touched on this, because music, in a lot of ways, it comes from cultural groups. It tends to get then stereotyped with particular cultural groups. This is the 50th anniversary of hip hop, for instance. And we all know what cultural group hip hop is associated with, right? And you ran into these communities that were closed communities of music: bluegrass, Texas fiddle, country music, jazz, classical music. and you crossed all the bridges between all these communities and then created an educational method that's helping other people cross the bridges between all of these other communities. There's something in there that you have to teach America at large, I think, right? About how we get trapped in our own ideas of what is good music, right? What is the right kind of music, and how to do the right kind of music. You've broken all those barriers down, and I think you have something to teach America about that.
Well, leaping from your message about purity, we faced that in music in the 60s and 70s. People were battening down the hatches. People became very conservative about their musical taste and insisted it must be like this. It was the era of technical training in music, and people, fenced up and closed off others. And so maybe in my circles, maybe it took this, little kid from Seattle who wasn't tied to any specific culture in music. I didn't have family members that played this stuff.
Word from the South, thank God.
And but I sure had my accent became America. I could speak Tennessean, North Carolinian, as well as and I go into the book about how I was able to kind of transform my character depending on what I was doing. It actually helped me focus. So, in one sense, I had a big, huge bull rider cowboy hat playing against the greats in the National Fiddle Championships. And then the next week, I'm out in California with my long, frizzy hair skateboarding and coming up with new progressive acoustic music, and I was just going around and around like that. I could turn around on a dime. And it was because my mother allowed me to be creative. A lot of people comment on my technical ability, but I'm telling you, the secret of my musical success is that I found that music was a way to express a personal expression. And that made all the difference, and it saved my life.
I want to turn to some of the questions that we've had from the audience, but one last question before we do that. You've played a lot of gospel music in your career, and to your mother's pleasure at times. And you've played gospel music with people who, how do I put this? Lived out the message that they were singing, and other times did not live out the message that they were singing. And you've trafficked in those communities with folks who were very much outwardly Christian and sometimes doing other things. I just kind of wanted to hear you talk about what has playing sacred music been like for you and for your own personal faith and philosophical journey.
Yeah, I recognize and experience a lot of hypocrisy as a child musician, being around some of these people who professed their Christianity through, I call them gospel sets that we played at festivals. And I have a line in there in the book that says that not everybody lived their life according to the gospel sets. So we were up here singing about Jesus for an hour, and then as soon as they get off the stage, right in front of me as a young child, they'd be doing all kinds of really, bad things that I could not report back to my mother, or she would bring me home and I wouldn't be able to play the music with these great musicians. So I had to navigate through a lot past that. I don't think that would happen today on that level, because once again, I was the one child with all these adults, older adults, and they really didn't know how to react to me. They just, I think part of their, they did not protect me. They treated me like another adult because I played like them. I could play with them. and they respected that. So they treated me like that, and I suppose there's a little bit of me that was going. I mean, I want to hang out with the big boys. I want to be treated like a grown-up, you know, but it went too far often, you know, and I was put into some really bad situations, and those are part of my story. But I learned how I connected music with my inner faith, that I could find myself through just hard work and never giving up on being a good force for good in my community and then beyond.
Well, and I've been witness to some of that, especially during the pandemic on Facebook. You taking a stand for what you felt like was right based on your faith and your philosophy and what you think music is all about, and getting a strong reaction from folks in a conservative community to your stance on that. And I just want to say it was an inspiration to me. So I'm really glad you figured out how to navigate through the treacherous waters of American Christianity and its hypocrisy to be able to come to the person that you are today, because it's been an inspiration to me and to a lot of other people I know.
Well, thank you very much. I've certainly faced criticism right from the very beginning as a child, and ultimately I never let it get me down. I always figured out a way to combat it, to come up with a new idea, you know, win on the ideas. The people who have the best ideas are going to move forward, and if it's not financially or economically, at least you can sleep at night.
You're right, that's right. Yeah. Okay, so here's some questions from the audience. We've had a few come in here. I'll try to make sure I can read these. They're handwritten, so forgive me, audience members. How did you meet Stefan Grappelli, and what has been his influence on you and the O'Connor method?
Yes, so I have a whole chapter in my book about how I met and played for and became Stefan Grappelli's protege at age 17 and 18. He was my final teacher. He was the great jazz violinist from Paris, France, and considered maybe the greatest jazz violin player ever. And he was such an inspirational figure, like Benny Thomason. He didn't teach very many people at all, just a handful in his lifetime, and I got to be one of those and was mentored by him. And so it's really an unlikely pairing, him 72, me at 17. And we ended up touring around the country together, played at Carnegie Hall together, ended up recording. And I think the way that he approached his music and the world with curiosity, I just loved, and it has a permanent impression on me. Yeah, sure, a lot of his messaging, just by the fact of what comes out of his violin, inspires the O'Connor method. You know, Ben referred to, you know, different subsects of American music, Texas style folk music and fiddling, and there's, you know, ranchero and mariachi, then there's the bluegrass, and on and on. When Stefan plays, you hear some of these extensions of who he is. There's the American jazz, you know, being from Paris, but he adopted jazz as his expression. But there was the French cafe that you could just feel in his music, and you could feel the gypsy come out from his long-term partnership with Django Reinhardt, one of the greatest guitar players in the world. And so, yeah, my mentors figure prominently in my story, and therefore in my method as well.
I was just thinking about how that intersects with a movement going on in our own community, which is people learning how to be elders in their families, in their communities, in their neighborhoods, in their churches. And you had a lot of people elder you and mentor you throughout your career that were really amazing. This question, I'm really glad somebody asked this because I'm super curious about this one. You grew up during a period of great rock and roll, early 70s, Zeppelin, Stones. How were you able to gravitate to bluegrass and other forms of music when your peers could have moved you into rock? And you played for some rock bands, right? The Dregs and others. And
Yeah.
well, I don't know if you want to, I don't even know if you can call the Dregs rock, right? Like everything you were in was always breaking the boundaries of every genre, right? The Dregs were like jazz, prog rock,
Yeah.
right? Or something?
Prog rock was really a big thing in the 70s, rock fusion. And so to answer your question, I got into electric guitar and rock. And I ended up in an entire rock and roll environment. The Dregs hired me in at 19 years old, and I was playing electric guitar, right there with Steve Morse, one of the great electric guitar players of all time, in this band, as well as electric violin. I was one of the first full-time electric violinists in '81. We actually had to invent a pickup to be able for me to play that loud beyond the existing pickups that were out at the time. And so we were in a rock and roll environment, and so that's what makes my story really pretty rich, because I'm covering a lot of musical ground here, even in my teen years. And so we're hanging out with, ZZ Top, Kansas, all these these big rock bands, and they all love us. I mean, we end up recording with Pat Simmons of the Doobie Brothers, and on, all these interactions. And so there's elements of rock and roll in my story as a teenager through this prog rock band that gave us access to all the rockers on the scene. And I lived a rock and roll life. We weren't, as I explained in the book, things got a little dicey. And we weren't living the life of a jazz student out of Berkeley or University of Miami or anything. We were right in those dirty clubs, playing around the country, playing in rock and roll environments. So somehow I survived that, barely. And got out and smelled the roses on the other side, and found my beautiful acoustic music again, which I've always embraced.
Yeah, if you read Guitar Player, you'd think Steve Morse was the greatest guitarist of all time.
Yeah.
According to Guitar Player.
Yes.
They're always saying that he's the best ever, right? And you were right there with him the whole time.
Tried. I mean, he schooled me. Like that was part, and he became my mentor. He was the band leader, but he became my teacher on electric guitar. And he would teach, can you imagine this, showing up every show at some club, and then Steve and I would be in the bathroom of the club, him schooling me on electric guitar. That was where my lessons were at that point. So my lessons started with Benny Thomason in a trailer on Clamor River, and then ended up, and then lessons, behind stage at Carnegie Hall with Grappelli, and now I'm back in the clubs, in these filthy bathrooms while the drummer and the bass player were sound checking on stage. Steve and I were in the bathroom going over our lines, and this went on for a year and a half. And so at the end of the story of the Dregs, he eventually turned on me, thinking that I was getting too good on the electric guitar. And I was at my wit's end. I'm going, Steve, you've schooled me this whole entire time to try to stay with you. And now that you believe that I'm actually finally staying with you, now you're all upset about it, And so it became a turf battle, and I was getting too much attention. And then once again, ridiculed, kicked out. And I had to find another path,
Yeah. The disappointments that you've gone through, in addition to all the success, and the illustration you just used with Steve, it's perfect for our final question. How do you stay grounded in an atmosphere of worldwide recognition, travel, interactions with famous and talented people? How do you stay grounded in the midst of all that? I mean, given what you just shared, even the greatest musicians in the world can be insecure and threatened. So how do you stay grounded with all that you've done?
Well, for the last 9 years, I've had a wonderful relationship with my wife, Maggie O'Connor. And she really has changed my life, helped my life. Matter of fact, I don't know if I could have written this book without Maggie. Maggie's inspiration and her encouragement and her confidence that I could become the writer that I needed to tell this story, because she knew, like some of you here, that I actually tried to write my story with co-writers 10 years ago, 8 years ago, and then I end up scrapping the projects because, as you would probably assume, I'd be pretty picky about putting my story out there as a child, dealing with, an alcoholic father, mother dying of cancer. I kind of want the words to be right, at least authentic to what I was feeling at the time. I didn't even trust myself as a 60-year-old to write about what a 13-year-old thought. I had to really make the investment and go back into time and study my archives, just study those photos in that book again and again, which is something I never really did much, because I'm kind of on to the next thing all the time. I'm not one to sit around and listen to my old recordings. I've never really done that, unless I had to learn something for a concert, for instance, like it was part of my work process. But with Maggie being an exceptional musician and artist, and her believing in my music to such an extent, and then her knowing that I probably should get this story written, because there's so many rumors about how I learned. There's a lot of disinformation about. There's stories out there where people thought that I'd always was a classical violin student, that I didn't learn fiddling authentically, that I somehow adopted it like many do. Like they start at classical violin, they're like, I like this fiddling. And my very first bow strokes for all these years, for years on, was from the perspective of an American fiddler. And even though I ended up playing with Yo-Yo Ma, that was the part that people were scratching their head going, no, that can't happen. So I needed to get that story down and written in a way where I felt good about sharing it, with the musical world, and so I hope it inspires you to my story, and it doesn't feel, now that this is published and it's out there, it doesn't really feel like my story anymore. It feels like an American story.
Yeah.
It feels like it's other people's story, because that really is what I'm here about. I'm trying to discover things for the audience, for other musicians, even though they don't appreciate. A lot of musicians remain competitive with me. They don't even appreciate the few doors that I'm trying to still break down, so they could if we could all enjoy a little bit more of a flexible, artistic life. But I really do it for others. That's the way my mom taught me. She said, "You've been given a gift, Mark. You've got to give back." And she told me that at 12 years old. So I had 15 students I was teaching, all ages, even adults. When I was 12, I had a whole little studio, giving back, because Mom said I need to give back. So a lot of great messaging from the older folks around me that cared.
Well, it's a remarkable story, and we've been doing a series this year called Tell Me Our Story, and in some ways, by telling your story, you told us a story about America, and a story about breaking down walls, and about a prodigy, and about the music world, and we couldn't be more grateful to you for sharing it with us. And we want to thank Maggie, too, who's here, for her part in this story, and for singing today. And we watch you both unfold together over the years as you've played with us, and Maggie coming into her own now as a singer, and in addition to being an incredible instrumentalist. It's been wonderful to be with you. We feel like you're part of our family, and we just want to say thank you again for sharing this with us. Let's give Mark a round of applause. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.